Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Explore Everything. Today we journey deep into one of the fiercest and most misunderstood chapters of American history, the entire history of the Apache Wars. From the deserts of Arizona to the mountains of New Mexico, this is the untold story of courage, betrayal, and survival, where the Apache warriors fought not for conquest, but for their very existence. Long before the world ever heard the name Apache, the rugged lands of the American Southwest, the deserts of Arizona, the mountains of New Mexico, the dry plains of Texas, and the deep canyons of northern Mexico, were already home to one of the most formidable and mysterious peoples on the continent. These were the Apache, a proud, nomadic group whose history stretches back centuries before European contact. Their story begins not with war but with survival, with families who learned to live, move, and thrive in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. The Apache were not a single tribe but rather a collection of related peoples: Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Lipan, Western Apache, and others, each with their own dialect, leadership, and territory, yet bound by shared language roots and a common spirit of independence. Their language, part of the Athabascan family, connected them to far northern relatives such as the Navajo and even distant tribes in Alaska and Canada. This linguistic link suggests that long ago, their ancestors migrated southward, adapting to new climates, new threats, and new ways of life until they became the desert warriors history remembers. Unlike the large, settled agricultural societies that built villages and traded crops, the Apache were semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers. They followed the rhythms of the land, hunting deer, antelope, and rabbits and gathering mescal, agave, nuts, and wild fruits. They moved with the seasons, living in small bands that could travel swiftly and quietly through the mountains or disappear into the deserts. This mobility became one of their greatest strengths, teaching them endurance, stealth, and an intimate knowledge of the land. Every canyon, every waterhole, every hidden trail was known to them. To outsiders, the desert was death. To the Apache, it was home, a living map of survival. Apache society was built around clans and family ties, not centralized power. Leadership was earned, not inherited. A chief was respected for wisdom, bravery, and generosity, but he ruled by persuasion, not force. If a leader lost the confidence of his people, they simply left and followed another. This decentralized structure made the Apache nearly impossible to conquer. Even if one band was defeated, another could rise miles away, guided by a new leader, fighting with the same fierce independence. This social design reflected their worldview: freedom above all else. They valued autonomy, for the tribe, for the family, and for the individual. To the Apache, captivity or submission was worse than death. Spiritually, the Apache world was alive with meaning. They believed in a universe filled with power, a spiritual force present in mountains, animals, winds, and dreams. The natural world was not something to be conquered, but to be respected and understood. The shaman, the medicine man, held a vital role, bridging the human and spirit worlds through rituals, songs, and visions. Ceremonies like the sunrise dance marked life's transitions, particularly the coming of age of young women, who were honored as life-givers and carriers of strength. The Apache saw themselves as part of the Earth's balance. Warriors, yes, but also caretakers of a sacred connection. But make no mistake, the Apache were warriors from necessity, not from cruelty. The harshness of the desert shaped them into a people who could fight for survival at any moment. They learned to strike fast and vanish before enemies could respond. Raiding was not mere banditry. It was a means of defense and survival in a land where resources were scarce. Horses, introduced by the Spanish in the 1600s, transformed Apache life. The once foot-bound bands became mounted masters of the open plains, able to travel vast distances, to raid distant settlements, or to flee deep into the mountains with astonishing speed. To later enemies, they seemed everywhere and nowhere, ghosts of the desert who struck like lightning and disappeared into the sands. Before the arrival of Europeans, Apache bands often traded with neighboring tribes, the Pueblo peoples, the Navajo, even the Comanche at times. But as Spanish colonists pushed northward from Mexico in the 16th and 17th centuries, everything changed. The Apache began to face new threats: armed soldiers, slave raids, missionaries, and settlers carving their way into ancestral lands. Yet in these early years, the Apache were not the aggressors history sometimes paints them as. They were reacting to invasion, defending the only world they had ever known. The Spanish called them Apaches de Guerra, the warlike Apaches. But that name reveals more about the Spanish fear than the Apache nature. The word Apache itself is believed to come from the Zuni word Apachu, meaning enemy. But to themselves they were Ndi, Ind, or Dine, simply the people. Their identity was not about conquest but belonging. They saw themselves as guardians of their lands, protectors of their families, and keepers of a code that prized courage, loyalty, and endurance above all else. Children were taught from a young age to move silently, to endure pain, to observe everything. A boy learned to hunt and ride, a girl to gather, to heal, to create. Their education came from life itself, from watching, listening, and surviving. To be Apache was to know how to live in balance with the land, and how to fight when that balance was threatened. The desert, brutal as it was, forged them into one of the most resilient and adaptive cultures in human history. By the early 1800s, the Apache world stretched across a vast region, from the Sierra Madre of Mexico to the Rio Grande, from the plains of Texas to the cliffs of Arizona. It was a land defined not by borders but by trails, canyons, and sacred sites. Yet their freedom was already under threat. Empires were rising, Spain, Mexico, and soon the United States, all claiming ownership of the same lands the Apache had roamed for centuries. The stage was being set for a conflict that would span decades, shaped by blood, betrayal, and unbreakable will. The Apache were not yet at war, but the winds of history were shifting. What began as a life of harmony and movement across the wild lands of the Southwest was about to become a struggle for survival against overwhelming odds. A struggle that would define them forever in the pages of American history. When the first Spanish explorers pushed north from Mexico in the 1500s, they entered a world both harsh and hauntingly beautiful. A land of crimson canyons, endless deserts, and silent mountains. They called it La Tierra Desconocida, the unknown land. But to the Apache, it was home, a living, breathing world they had known for generations. The Spanish came in search of gold, glory, and souls to convert. The Apache saw only strangers with metal armor, thundering horses, and strange weapons that spat fire. The first recorded contact between the Apache and Europeans occurred around the 1540s, during the expedition of Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, who led hundreds of soldiers northward from Mexico in search of the mythical seven cities of gold. Coronado's men encountered various native tribes along the way, and though they may not have known it then, they were setting in motion centuries of conflict. These early meetings were cautious, filled with curiosity and mistrust. The Apache watched from a distance, testing the strange invaders who rode animals faster than deer and carried weapons deadlier than arrows. At first, there was little reason for direct confrontation. The Apache were nomadic, moving across lands the Spanish found too dry and barren for profitable settlement. But as Spanish missions and presidios, military forts, began spreading through what is now New Mexico, Arizona, and northern Mexico, the two worlds collided. The Spanish brought not only steel and gunpowder, but also disease, slavery, and domination. Smallpox swept through native populations with devastating speed, weakening communities before a single battle was fought. The Apache, ever observant, saw what had happened to the more settled Pueblo peoples under Spanish rule. Villages enslaved, families broken, culture suppressed under the weight of foreign gods and kings. The Apache would not kneel so easily. The Spanish soon learned that the Apache were unlike any people they had encountered before. They struck without warning, vanishing into the mountains before retaliation could form. They could travel for days without food, read the land like a map, and fight with a ferocity that seemed to come from the earth itself. To Spanish soldiers used to fighting on open plains or behind walls, the Apache way of war was infuriating and terrifying, a shadow war fought in silence and speed. But the Apache too were learning. From these early encounters, they discovered the power of Spanish horses and weapons. Over time, through raids and captures, they acquired their own horses, forever transforming their mobility and strength. The introduction of the horse turned the Apache from regional raiders into one of the most mobile fighting forces in North America. Suddenly, the vast distances between river valleys and mountain passes meant nothing. The Apache could appear anywhere at any time. The Spanish viewed them as savages to be tamed. The Apache saw the Spanish as invaders to be resisted. And yet, their relationship was not always one of open war. There were times of uneasy peace, built on fragile trade and temporary alliances. Apache bands sometimes traded animal hides, salt, and captives in exchange for food, tools, or weapons. The Spanish governors in Santa Fe often preferred negotiation to endless fighting, offering rations and supplies to Apache groups in exchange for peace. These moments of cooperation were practical, not emotional. Both sides knew the peace would never last long. The mission system was perhaps the most destructive element of Spanish expansion. Catholic missionaries, believing they were saving souls, sought to bring the Apache into settled communities, to teach them farming, Spanish, and Christianity. But to the Apache, This was captivity disguised as salvation. They were forced to abandon their old ways, give up their mobility, and submit to the rule of priests and soldiers. The Apache way of life, free, mobile, self-reliant, could not survive within stone walls. Many who were captured or coerced into missions escaped, returning to the wild and vowing never again to be tamed. By the early 1600s, the Spanish had built a line of presidios across northern Mexico, meant to contain Apache raids. Towns like Llanos, Fronteras, and El Paso became military outposts constantly on alert. Every night, watchmen scanned the horizon for the smoke of Apache camps or the flicker of distant fires. The Apache, driven by both revenge and survival, struck caravans, raided ranches, and freed captives. They took horses, food, and weapons not out of greed, but because the Spanish had left them few other choices. To live free they had to fight. The Spanish response was brutal. They organized Apache campaigns, hunting parties of soldiers and native allies sent to destroy Apache bands, seize women and children, and claim bounties for scalps. Some colonial governors even offered payment for Apache heads, a grim business that fueled cycles of violence across the frontier. But the Apache endured. Their deep knowledge of the land and their decentralized tribal system made them impossible to eradicate. You could destroy one camp, but a dozen others would live on. You could kill one chief, but no single man commanded all the Apache. In time, the Spanish realized that complete conquest was impossible. The Apache were not a fortress to be taken. They were the wind and the fire, untouchable, always moving. Instead, Spanish authorities began developing a system of peace through trade, providing the Apache with food and goods in exchange for peace treaties. Some Apache leaders accepted these arrangements for practical reasons, food in exchange for temporary calm, while others saw them as deceit. To the Apache, a man's word was sacred. To the Spanish, treaties were tools. Inevitably, promises were broken and war flared again. Through the centuries of Spanish rule, from the 1500s to the early 1800s, the Apache adapted and survived. They learned to navigate between peace and war, between diplomacy and defiance. They absorbed the new tools of their enemies while never surrendering their independence. The Apache world had changed forever, but their spirit had not. They were learning what it meant to face empires, and to outlast them. And when the Spanish Empire began to crumble in the early 19th century and Mexico rose in its place, the Apache found themselves facing a new flag, a new government, and a new kind of warfare. The old enemy was gone, but the struggle was far from over. The fight for their land and their freedom had only just begun. By the early 1800s, the old Spanish Empire was crumbling. The once mighty colonial forces that had ruled vast lands from Mexico to California were fading into history. In 1821, Mexico gained its independence from Spain, and with that victory came new maps, new governments, and new ambitions. But for the Apache, nothing really changed. The same lands they had roamed for centuries were now claimed by a new power, one just as eager to control, tax, and settle their territory. The flags changed, the language of the soldiers changed, but the pressure on the Apache world only grew stronger. At first, the newly formed Mexican Republic hoped to bring peace to the northern frontier. The endless wars with Apache and Comanche bands had drained the Spanish treasury, and now Mexico was struggling to maintain order. To calm the borderlands, Mexican officials offered the Apache trade, food, and promises, much like the Spanish before them. In exchange, they wanted peace and loyalty. But the truth was that Mexico's grip on its northern lands was weak. The presidios were underfunded, soldiers went unpaid, and supplies often never arrived. The frontier became a place of desperation. Hungry settlers, broken treaties, and constant raids. The Apache, skilled at reading the strength of their enemies, saw the weakness immediately. Where the Spanish had been relentless and organized, the Mexicans were divided and poorly supplied. The Chiricahua and Mescalero Apache in particular began striking deep into northern Mexico, into Sonora, Chihuahua, and Durango, raiding villages, ranches, and caravans. To the Apache, these were acts of survival and revenge. To the Mexicans, they were acts of terror. The wars that followed were some of the most brutal in frontier history. Entire towns were abandoned, trade routes cut off, and thousands killed on both sides. The Mexican government, desperate and angry, began offering bounties for Apache scalps. Men called scalp hunters, many of them American mercenaries, roamed the borderlands, killing indiscriminately. The practice was horrific. Apache warriors, women, and even children were hunted like animals. But the violence only hardened Apache resolve. They fought back with unmatched ferocity, striking faster and vanishing into the mountains before retribution could come. The deserts of northern Mexico became a graveyard of vengeance, a place where no peace lasted long. Yet while Mexico bled in the south, a new power was rising from the east, one that would change everything. In 1846, the United States declared war on Mexico, driven by a hunger for land and the dream of manifest destiny, the belief that it was America's divine right to expand across the continent. Within 2 years, the U.S. had crushed the Mexican army and seized half its territory. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 redrew the map of North America, and with a few strokes of a pen, the Apache homeland was split in two, half in the United States, half in Mexico. To the Apache, of course, these borders meant nothing. Their lands had always been defined by mountains, rivers, and trails, not lines on a foreign map. But for the new powers, the land was now property, and property needed control. The U.S. Army quickly established forts across the Southwest: Fort Bowie, Fort Stanton, Fort Apache, and many more, marking the beginning of a new era of frontier conflict. American settlers, miners, and ranchers began pouring westward, bringing with them wagons, cattle, and claims to land that had belonged to the Apache for generations. Towns rose where once there were sacred hunting grounds. Rivers were dammed, forests cut, and the balance the Apache had kept with nature for centuries began to disappear. At first, the Apache observed the newcomers with caution. The Americans were different from the Spanish and Mexicans. They were better armed, more organized, and far more determined to stay. The U.S. government sent agents to negotiate peace treaties, offering rations, supplies, and protection in exchange for the Apache's promise to stop raiding. But to the Apache, these treaties were meaningless words on paper. They saw no reason to surrender their freedom to a foreign government that didn't understand them, didn't speak their language, and had no respect for their way of life. The Americans, meanwhile, misunderstood the Apache entirely. They saw them as savages to be civilized, not as a people defending their ancestral home. To them, the Apache were an obstacle to progress, dangerous remnants of a wild land that needed to be tamed. This misunderstanding would ignite decades of bloodshed. One of the first sparks came with the Bascom Affair of 1861, when a U.S. Army officer, Lieutenant George Bascom, accused the great Apache leader Cochise of kidnapping a white boy. The accusation was false, but when Bascom tried to capture Cochise under a flag of truce, the encounter turned deadly. Cochise escaped, but several of his family members were killed or hanged. That single act of betrayal destroyed years of fragile peace and unleashed a wave of violence that swept across Arizona and New Mexico. From that moment, the Apache Wars as history remembers them truly began. But in the years leading up to that fateful moment, during this transition between Mexico and the United States, the Apache world was already transforming. They had seen empires rise and fall: Spain, Mexico, and now America. Each claimed dominion over the same lands, each promised peace and delivered war. Yet through it all, the Apache remained unbroken. They adapted, learned their enemies' languages and tactics, and continued to fight for one thing: the right to live free on their own land. As the 1850s gave way to the 1860s, the American frontier hardened into a battlefield. Soldiers hunted Apache bands across deserts and canyons. Settlers demanded protection, miners demanded land, and newspapers back east demanded Indian removal. The struggle that began centuries earlier, between a people of the land and those who sought to possess it, was entering its bloodiest chapter yet. The Apache had survived the Spanish and the Mexicans. But the storm that was coming, the American expansion with its endless soldiers, rifles, and railroads, would test them in ways they had never faced before. A new kind of war was about to begin, one that would decide not just the fate of the Apache, but the soul of the American West itself. As the sun set on the 1850s, the Apache world stood on a fragile edge between peace and war. Across the deserts and mountains of the Southwest, American forts gleamed like iron scars upon the land, symbols of a new empire rising over ancient ground. Soldiers came bearing flags and treaties, speaking words of peace that glimmered with hope but rang hollow with deception. The Apache listened, watched, and waited. They had heard such promises before, from the Spanish, from the Mexicans, and they knew how easily those promises turned to lies. To the American government, treaties were political tools, temporary agreements meant to calm the frontier until more settlers arrived. To the Apache, however, a man's word was sacred. An agreement, once spoken, bound both sides in honor. But time after time, the United States broke that sacred trust. Treaties were signed, then forgotten. Reservations were promised, then taken away. Supplies were pledged, but never delivered. Each betrayal deepened the wounds between the Apache and the Americans, until trust was replaced by rage. In the early years of U.S. occupation, Some Apache bands attempted diplomacy. Leaders like Mongas Coloradus, the powerful chief of the Chiricahua Apache, sought understanding. He met with American officers, hoping for coexistence, believing perhaps that these new foreigners might be different from those before them. For a brief moment there was hope. Trade flourished and small settlements coexisted near Apache territory. But the peace was fragile and greed would soon shatter it. When gold was discovered in Pinos Altos in the late 1850s, miners flooded into Apache lands without permission. They built camps, cut down sacred trees, polluted streams, and treated Apache people with cruelty and arrogance. When Apache warriors defended their territory, the miners demanded protection from the U.S. Army. The soldiers came, not as peacekeepers but as conquerors. Skirmishes broke out, and the peace Mongas Coloradus had worked so hard to preserve began to crumble. The Apache quickly learned that the Americans were not content to share the land, they wanted to own it. The newcomers claimed every mountain, every river, every hidden valley as property of the United States. They fenced off what had once been open trails and built roads through sacred grounds. For a people whose identity was tied to freedom of movement, this was not merely theft, it was the erasure of their way of life. Still, the Apache tried to negotiate. Time and again they were told, "If you will live peacefully on this reservation, we will feed you, protect you, and let you live in peace." But the reservations were often barren wastelands where crops failed and game was scarce. The rations promised by the government arrived spoiled or not at all. Soldiers stationed at nearby forts treated Apache families with disdain, sometimes abuse. Corrupt agents sold supplies meant for the Apache to settlers, lining their own pockets while the people starved. The message was clear: the promises of the white men could not be trusted. Then came the Bascom Affair of 1861, the spark that set the frontier ablaze. A young U.S. officer, Lieutenant George Bascom, accused the Apache leader Cochise of kidnapping a white boy. The boy had been taken by another band entirely, but Bascom refused to listen. He lured Cochise and his family under a flag of truce to Fort Buchanan, then tried to arrest them. Cochise escaped by cutting through the tent wall with his knife, but several of his relatives were captured and later executed. In retaliation, Cochise began a campaign of vengeance, attacking stagecoaches, settlements, and army patrols across southern Arizona. The Americans responded with equal brutality, burning villages and killing Apache prisoners. The cycle of revenge had begun, and it would not end for decades. From that moment forward, the Apache understood that there could be no trust between them and the United States. Every peace talk that followed was seen through eyes hardened by betrayal. Even those who sought diplomacy, men like Victorio, Loco, and Del Shay, found that the word of the U.S. government was as shifting as desert sand. The most tragic of these betrayals came years later, when Mongas Coloradus, now an aging leader, agreed to meet American officers under a flag of peace. He hoped to negotiate terms that might spare his people further bloodshed. Instead, he was taken prisoner, tortured, and brutally murdered at Fort McLean, his head severed and sent east for scientific study. When news of his death reached the Apache bands, grief turned to fury. The murder of Mongas Coloradus became a rallying cry, proof that the Americans had no honor. For the Apache, the war was now personal. Even as the U.S. government spoke of peace, its settlers continued to push deeper into Apache lands. Railroads cut through hunting grounds, soldiers built more forts, and the telegraph, that strange humming string of metal, carried messages of control across the wilderness. Every new mile of progress was a wound carved into the Apache homeland. The broken promises extended even to those who surrendered in good faith. Bands that agreed to live on reservations were often relocated again and again, each move taking them farther from their ancestral mountains, their sacred rivers, and the graves of their ancestors. When they resisted, they were branded as hostiles. When they complied, they were forgotten. There was no justice, no safety, only the slow erosion of everything they had once been. By the mid-1860s, the Apache had learned a cruel truth. Peace with the United States was an illusion. The government spoke with two tongues, one of friendship and one of conquest. Behind every treaty stood soldiers, and behind every promise stood greed. The Apache no longer believed in words. They believed only in action, in the rifle, the horse, and the mountains that had sheltered them for generations. The desert had taught them endurance. The mountains had taught them patience. And the betrayal of the white man had taught them that survival now depended on one thing: resistance. The time for diplomacy was over. The time for war had come. In the early months of 1861, the high deserts of Arizona were quiet, deceptively so. The wind carried only the whispers of mesquite leaves and the distant cry of hawks. For years, there had been an uneasy peace between the Apache and the newcomers who now claimed their lands. Chief Cochise, leader of the Chiricahua Apache, had tried to maintain that fragile balance. Proud yet pragmatic, he believed that his people could coexist with the Americans if both sides respected one another. But that illusion of peace was about to be shattered by a single tragic mistake, an act of arrogance and misunderstanding that would set the frontier ablaze. It began near Sonoita Creek, south of modern-day Tucson. A rancher's son, a boy named Felix Ward, was taken during a raid by a group of Apache. In the chaos, several cattle were stolen and a white herder was killed. Word spread quickly and panic gripped the small settlements scattered across the territory. To the Americans, every Apache was the same, a nameless enemy lurking in the canyons. But in truth, the raid had been carried out not by Cochise's Chiricahua, but by another Apache band entirely, possibly the Coyotero or Pinal group, who had no alliance with Cochise. Into this tense and uncertain moment stepped Lieutenant George Nicholas Bascom, a young and ambitious officer newly assigned to Fort Buchanan. He was only in his mid-20s, eager to prove himself, and utterly unfamiliar with the complex web of Apache politics. When word of the kidnapping reached him, he was given a simple order: find the boy and punish the guilty. Bascom, confident in his authority, assumed that Cochise, the most prominent Apache chief in the region, must be responsible. It was a fatal assumption. When Cochise was summoned to the fort, he came willingly. He arrived with several of his family members, including his brother, his wife, and 2 nephews. He came not as a warrior but as a negotiator, expecting to talk peacefully and help locate the boy. As he entered Bascom's tent, he carried no weapon, a sign of trust under the traditional flag of truce. In Apache culture, such a meeting was sacred. Once a man offered his hand in peace, his word was his bond. But Bascom did not understand these customs. He saw only an opportunity to capture a chief and force answers from him. The meeting began calmly enough. Bascom accused Cochise of kidnapping the boy. Cochise, startled and offended, denied any involvement and offered to help find the real culprits. He even proposed bringing in the guilty band himself if Bascom would give him time. But the young lieutenant, mistrusting every word, made a fateful decision. He ordered his men to arrest Cochise and his family on the spot. In that instant, the air inside the tent turned electric with danger. The Apache chief, realizing the betrayal, moved like lightning. With a single motion, he slashed through the tent wall with his knife and sprinted into the night, escaping into the darkness as bullets tore through the air behind him. But his family, his brother, 2 nephews, and his wife, were taken prisoner. The sacred trust of a peace talk had been violated. To Cochise, this was not just an insult, it was a declaration of war. In the days that followed, Cochise struck back with precision and fury. He captured several Americans, soldiers and civilians alike, hoping to exchange them for his family's release. But Bascom refused. Both sides began executing prisoners in retaliation. One by one, hostages were hanged or shot, their bodies left as grim messages along the trails. What had begun as a misunderstanding over a missing boy had spiraled into blood vengeance. The violence spread like wildfire. Stagecoaches were ambushed, settlers attacked, and ranches burned across southern Arizona. The once peaceful valleys around Fort Buchanan became killing grounds. Cochise, joined by other Apache warriors, launched a relentless campaign of guerrilla warfare. They struck swiftly, vanishing into the Dragoon Mountains and Sierra Madre before soldiers could respond. To the Americans, it seemed as if the very desert itself had turned against them. The U.S. Army retaliated with overwhelming force. Reinforcements were sent from California, and new forts were built to pacify the region. But they were fighting an enemy who could not be cornered. The Apache knew every canyon, every trail, every hiding place. They fought on their own terms, unseen by day, unstoppable by night. Soldiers found themselves chasing shadows, ambushed again and again in the same rugged terrain. What the army saw as savagery was, in truth, a brilliant form of resistance honed over generations. For Cochise, however, the war was not born of hatred, it was born of betrayal. He had not sought conflict, it had been forced upon him. The flag of truce that had been broken in Bascom's tent had shattered his faith in white men's promises forever. From that moment, every treaty, every handshake, every offer of peace would be met with suspicion. The Apache learned that the Americans' honor was not the same as theirs, that words could be broken as easily as a twig in the desert wind. The Bascom affair became a symbol, the moment when diplomacy died and the Apache Wars truly began. For more than a decade afterward, Cochise led his people through a storm of violence, outsmarting U.S. forces time and again. He struck supply lines, destroyed wagon trains, and outmaneuvered armies 10 times his size. His name became legend, whispered in fear by settlers, spoken in reverence by his people. To the Apache, Cochise was more than a warrior. He was a defender of honor, the man who refused to bow. And yet, even as the fighting raged, Cochise remained a man of reason. He sought peace when peace was offered sincerely, and vengeance when it was not. Years later, when the great scout Thomas Jeffords approached him as a true friend, unarmed and unafraid, Cochise listened. For the first time since Bascom's betrayal, he saw an American whose word could be trusted. Their friendship would lead at last to a fragile peace, but that was still years away. For now, the wounds of the Bascom affair bled across the desert, marking the beginning of an endless war between two worlds that could never truly understand each other. The desert winds carried the echoes of gunfire, the cries of the dying, and the whispers of vengeance. The peace that might have been was gone forever, replaced by fire, fear, and the long, unforgiving road of war. By the late 1870s, the sun was setting on the Apache world. The once proud tribes, Mescalero, Chiricahua, and White Mountain Apache, had been scattered, pushed onto bleak reservations under the watchful eyes of U.S. soldiers. The great war chiefs who once rode free through the canyons were gone or broken. Cochise had died in his mountain stronghold, finally laid to rest with the bittersweet promise of peace. But peace, as it turned out, was only an illusion, a fragile mask stretched over injustice and despair. Among those who refused to bow was one man, Geronimo. His Apache name was Goyle, meaning the one who yawns. But there was nothing weary or passive about him. Geronimo's spirit burned like fire in dry grass. He had known loss deeper than most men could imagine, loss that would shape him into the most feared and relentless warrior of the American frontier. The story began in 1851, years before he became a legend. Geronimo's band was camped peacefully near Llanos in northern Mexico, when soldiers from Sonora attacked without warning. When the smoke cleared, his mother, his wife Elope, and his 3 small children lay dead among the ashes. The grief that filled him that day was so vast that it swallowed his soul. He fell to his knees, and as he later told it, a great power entered him, a voice that spoke through thunder and promised him protection from bullets. From that moment on, Geronimo believed he could not die by a white man's weapon. He would make war not for land but for vengeance. And vengeance became his destiny. For decades, Geronimo roamed the borderlands between Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico, leading a small but unstoppable band of Apache warriors. The U.S. Army called him a murderer. His people called him a protector. To the settlers, he was a ghost, striking from nowhere, vanishing into the mountains before anyone could follow. He was not a chief in the political sense. He was a spiritual leader, a warrior guided by visions. And those visions kept him alive through endless hunts and battles. His enemies feared that no bullet could touch him, and time after time he proved them right. After Cochise's death, the fragile peace between the Chiricahua Apache and the U.S. collapsed once more. The new agents on the San Carlos Reservation treated the Apache with cruelty and corruption. Supplies promised by the government never arrived, food was scarce, and disease spread. Soldiers humiliated warriors, tore families apart, and punished anyone who dared to leave the boundaries of the barren land. To men like Geronimo, this wasn't peace, it was imprisonment. And so, in 1876 he fled. He and his warriors vanished into the mountains once again, living off the land, striking out at soldiers and settlements alike. Each time the army thought they had him surrounded, he slipped away, guided by terrain only the Apache truly understood. He crossed freely into Mexico, striking both American and Mexican forces who pursued him. The Sierra Madre Mountains became his fortress, rugged, remote, and impossible to conquer. For the next decade, Geronimo would become a ghost in the wilderness. U.S. generals threw thousands of soldiers, scouts, and even Apache trackers into the hunt. Yet Geronimo evaded them all, moving with the silence of a shadow and the cunning of a coyote. He knew when to fight, when to vanish, and when to let the desert do the killing. Among those sent to capture him was General George Crook, one of the few white men who understood the Apache way. Crook tried diplomacy, promising Geronimo safety if he returned peacefully. For a brief time, Geronimo accepted, tired of blood and exile. But when he discovered that U.S. officials planned to imprison his people far from their homeland, he fled once again into Mexico, taking his warriors with him. This final campaign, 1885 to 1886, would become the most famous pursuit in the history of the American West. For over a year, Geronimo's small band, fewer than 40 men, women, and children, were hunted by 5,000 U.S. soldiers, 3,000 Mexican troops, and countless Apache scouts. He was pursued by both nations yet captured by neither. Reports of his raids spread like wildfire. Settlers abandoned towns, newspapers painted him as a savage ghost, and soldiers spoke his name with awe and frustration. He would appear hundreds of miles from where scouts last saw him, his movements unpredictable, his spirit unbroken. But by the summer of 1886, the long years of running began to take their toll. His followers were starving, exhausted, and surrounded on all sides. In September, deep in the Sierra Madre, he met with General Nelson Miles, Crook's replacement. Geronimo stood proud, defiant, his eyes burning with fury and sorrow. He had fought the mightiest army on the continent for over 3 decades, and now at last he was tired. Under the blazing desert sun, Geronimo surrendered. It was the end of the Apache Wars, and with it the end of free Apache life. But even in defeat, his spirit would not die. He became a prisoner of war, sent first to Florida, then to Alabama, and finally to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. There, the great warrior who once roamed the deserts now sold his signature at fairs and rode in parades, the government symbol of a tamed savage. Yet those who looked into his eyes saw something different, a man who had never truly surrendered inside. Geronimo lived until 1909, dying at nearly 80 years old. On his deathbed, he whispered words that carried all the weight of his people's story. "I should never have surrendered. I should have fought until I was the last man alive." And perhaps in some way he did. For Geronimo's name became immortal, a symbol of resistance, courage, and the unbreakable will of a people who refused to vanish. His legacy outlived every soldier who hunted him, every general who claimed victory. To this day, when paratroopers leap from airplanes, they shout his name, Geronimo, as a cry of fearless defiance. They may not know the full story behind that name, of the man who fought the storm of history and stood tall even as the world tried to bury him, but in every echo of that cry lives the same fire that burned in the heart of Geronimo, the last Apache warrior who never truly gave up. By the time Geronimo surrendered in 1886, the desert had gone quiet. The echo of rifles no longer cracked across the canyons, and the smoke of burning camps drifted away into the endless sky. The long war, one that had raged across the Southwest for nearly 4 decades, was finally over. But for the Apache, the silence that followed was not peace. It was the silence of loss, the silence of a people watching their world disappear before their eyes. The Apache Wars were never just about territory. They were about freedom, the sacred right to live and move across the land without boundaries. To the Apache, the desert, the mountains, and the rivers were not property. They were family, living spirits that gave life and meaning. But now, those sacred lands were carved up, fenced off, and renamed. Soldiers built forts where sacred fires once burned. Settlers plowed over trails that had carried the footsteps of generations. The land of the Apache had become the property of the United States. And their freedom, the very essence of who they were, was gone. When Geronimo and his followers were finally captured, the U.S. government celebrated it as the final victory of the frontier. Newspapers declared that the Indian problem was solved, that civilization had triumphed over savagery. Across the country, people cheered, believing that the West was now safe for settlement and progress. But no one cheered in the Apache camps. Because for them, victory had come at the price of extinction. After his surrender, Geronimo's people, about 500 Chiricahua Apache men, women, and children, were treated not as prisoners of war but as criminals. They were packed into trains like cattle and shipped thousands of miles away from their homeland. First to Fort Marion, Florida, where the air was thick and suffocating, far from the cool mountain winds they had always known. Disease spread quickly. Dozens died within months. Children were separated from parents. Families that had survived decades of war were torn apart by bureaucracy and neglect. Those who survived were later moved again, to Mount Vernon Barracks, Alabama, and finally to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The government called it relocation. The Apache called it exile. For years they lived under guard, prisoners in their own land. They were not allowed to return to Arizona, even after peace had been declared. The very mountains where their ancestors were buried, the sacred homeland of Chiricahua, Dragoon, and Sierra Madre, were closed to them forever. Soldiers watched them day and night, afraid that even in captivity the Apache spirit might rise again. Some tried to adapt. They built small homes, planted crops, sent their children to missionary schools. Others refused to accept the new life forced upon them. They held on to their traditions in secret, singing the old songs, whispering prayers to the mountain spirits that still called them from far away. But every year their numbers grew smaller. Every year the fire of the Apache nation burned dimmer. Meanwhile the American West transformed. Railroads sliced across the plains, telegraph wires stretched from town to town, and gold and cattle drove settlers deeper into the frontier. The same land that had once been the Apache's sanctuary became a symbol of American expansion and manifest destiny. History was being rewritten, and in the new version the Apache were painted as villains, raiders, and thieves, rather than defenders of their own homeland. Yet even in this tragedy something remarkable endured: the Apache pride. They had been beaten but never broken. Their spirit lived on in the stories, in the names carved into stone, in the wind that whispered through the canyons they once ruled. Every elder who survived captivity became a living archive of history, teaching the young to remember who they were, and where they came from. As the 20th century dawned, the world around them changed even faster. The U.S. Army that had once hunted them now asked them to ride in parades. Photographers lined up to capture their faces, to turn warriors into symbols. They dressed Geronimo in buckskins, placed him on horseback, and paraded him before cheering crowds at world fairs and expositions. To the public he was a novelty, the last wild Apache. But behind his dark eyes burned something deeper, something the crowd could not understand, a sorrow that time could never erase. When Geronimo died in 1909 at Fort Sill, he was still a prisoner of war, even after more than 20 years of captivity. He had asked many times to return to his homeland in Arizona to die under the same sky where he was born. The request was always denied. He passed away in the cold of winter, far from his sacred mountains, whispering that he regretted surrendering. With his death, a chapter of history closed, not just for the Apache but for all of America. The Apache Wars had ended, but the scars they left would never fully heal. In the decades that followed, historians would romanticize the conflict, turning the Apache warriors into legends, their battles into myths. But behind every legend was a truth. A nation destroyed not because it was weak, but because it stood in the path of an empire that would take nothing less than total domination. The Apache fought longer, harder, and with more skill than any other native tribe in American history. They resisted 4 nations: Spain, Mexico, the Republic of Texas, and the United States, and for centuries they survived them all. They adapted, they endured, and even in defeat, they preserved something that no army could conquer: their identity. Today the descendants of the Apache live across the American Southwest, in Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma, carrying forward the songs, the stories, and the spirit of those who came before. When the desert wind rises, when the thunder rolls through the canyons, they say it is the voice of the old warriors, Geronimo, Cochise, Victorio, and Mangas Coloradas, still riding through the land that once belonged to them. The wars may have ended, but the story of the Apache, their courage, their loss, and their unbroken pride, still echoes through the heart of the American West. The land remembers them, and so must we. When the last shots of the Apache Wars faded into silence, it seemed the story of the Apache nation had ended. Their warriors were gone, their lands taken, their freedom buried beneath the advance of the American frontier. But history, as it often does, tells only half the story. Because though their world was broken, their spirit, that fierce, unyielding Apache spirit, refused to die. The Apache people did not vanish. They endured. Across the deserts and mountains where their ancestors once rode, their descendants still live, in Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas, carrying within them a living memory of all that came before. Their communities, small but strong, preserve the traditions that even the U.S. Army could not destroy: the songs, the language, the stories of the old warriors. And perhaps the most powerful legacy of all, the Apache way of life, still breathes quietly beneath modern skin. To the Apache, survival was never just about living. It was about balance, harmony with the land, with one another, and with the unseen world of spirits that guided every step. Long before the settlers came, the Apache believed that every mountain, every stream, every wind carried a soul. They saw the earth not as a possession but as a relative, a living being deserving of respect. That wisdom, buried under centuries of colonization, is now being rediscovered. In recent years, Apache elders have begun teaching their young once more, reviving language classes, sacred ceremonies, and traditional songs that nearly disappeared under the weight of assimilation. The Western Apache and Chiricahua Apache dialects, once forbidden in schools, are now spoken again in classrooms, sung in ceremonies, and taught through online archives. What the government once called savage superstition, is now recognized as priceless cultural heritage. The reservations where they were once imprisoned have become centers of cultural revival. On the San Carlos Apache Reservation, the drumbeat of ceremonies echoes through the desert each year during the sunrise dance, a coming-of-age ritual for young Apache women that celebrates strength, endurance, and connection to the earth. On the Mescalero Reservation in New Mexico, the annual Mountain Spirit Dance honors the 4 sacred mountains and the ancestors who still watch over them. These are not reenactments of the past, they are living traditions still pulsing with power. But the Apache legacy is not only spiritual. It's practical, physical, and woven into the very fabric of the modern world. The Apache were among the greatest strategists and survivalists the earth has ever known. Their techniques, moving silently across desert terrain, reading the wind, tracking by stars, are now studied by military historians and survival experts alike. Even the U.S. Army that once hunted them learned from their tactics, adopting elements of their guerrilla warfare techniques for later conflicts. In a strange twist of history, the very people once labeled as savages became the teachers of those who conquered them. And their influence extends even further. Apache Scouts, the same warriors who once fought for freedom, later served in the U.S. Army as some of its most skilled trackers. Many of their descendants would go on to serve in both world wars, in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Some painted the same red stripes on their helmets that their ancestors painted on their faces before battle. The old spirit never left, it simply adapted. Beyond the battlefield, the Apache legacy has shaped culture, language, and art. The very name Apache has come to symbolize courage and independence. You'll find it on helicopters, computer systems, and motorcycles. Modern machines named after a people who refuse to be conquered. Yet behind that powerful name lies a deeper truth. The Apache were not just warriors, they were philosophers, poets, and caretakers of the land. In their songs, they speak of stars as brothers, rivers as mothers, and the wind as a friend. They taught that no man owns the earth, he only borrows it from his children. And now, in a time when the world faces climate crisis and environmental loss, those ancient Apache lessons have never been more relevant. Their worldview, that life must move in balance with nature, has found new meaning for generations searching for harmony in a chaotic world. Still, the scars of the past remain. Many Apache communities continue to face poverty, limited access to education, and the lingering effects of historical trauma. The ghosts of the reservation still haunt their memory. But even in the face of hardship, a quiet resilience shines through. Apache youth programs now teach traditional language, songs, and history alongside modern skills, reminding the next generation that strength comes from knowing who you are. And across America, more people than ever before are beginning to listen. Museums, filmmakers, and educators are working alongside Apache historians to tell the story not from the victor's viewpoint, but from the Apache heart itself. No longer are they footnotes in someone else's history. They are the narrators of their own. To visit Apache land today is to walk through layers of time, to feel the past breathing beneath your feet. The same red earth that once carried the footprints of Cochise, Geronimo, Victorio, and Mongas Coloradas still whispers their names when the wind moves through the canyon. And the people who live there, farmers, soldiers, teachers, artists, carry the blood of those who fought for every inch of that sacred soil. The Apache story is not one of defeat. It is one of endurance, of surviving what could not be survived. It is proof that even when the world tries to erase a people, culture can endure in memory, in song, and in the unbroken spirit of those who refuse to forget. Today, when the thunder rolls across the desert and lightning cracks the sky, some say it is the old warriors riding once more, their horses made of storm clouds, their voices carried on the rain. And if you listen closely in the wind between the cliffs, you can still hear the echo of their promise. We are still here. We will always be here. Long after the rifles of the frontier fell silent and the last smoke of war drifted away from the desert, the spirit of the Apache warrior refused to rest. The people who had once fought to defend their homeland against impossible odds would soon carry that same courage onto new battlefields, far from the red canyons of Arizona and the dry wind of New Mexico. They had lost their land but not their honor. They had lost their freedom but not their strength. And when the world called again, when freedom itself was in danger, the Apache answered. The story begins during the darkest years of the 20th century, the years of World War II. Across the globe, nations were locked in the deadliest conflict in human history. In Europe and the Pacific, the United States faced enemies who intercepted and decoded military communications faster than ever before. The need for secure, unbreakable communication was desperate. And that's when the U.S. military turned to an ancient strength, a strength born not of machines or mathematics, but of language. Native American languages had long been dismissed, suppressed, even forbidden in boarding schools. Children were beaten for speaking the words of their ancestors. Yet now those same languages, once silenced, became the key to victory. They were complex, unwritten, and utterly indecipherable to outsiders. Among the tribes chosen for this secret mission were the Navajo, Comanche, Choctaw, and, often forgotten but equally vital, the Apache. The Apache code talkers carried forward a legacy that stretched back through generations of warriors. They were the grandsons of Geronimo, the descendants of the same scouts who once guided the U.S. Army through the mountains, and sometimes guided them into ambush. Now, wearing the same uniform as those who had once hunted their ancestors, they fought not for vengeance but for duty, loyalty, and survival. These men were raised in the desert, taught from birth to move silently, observe sharply, and trust their instincts. The military quickly realized what Apache warriors had always known. Their ability to adapt, to communicate in secrecy, and to understand terrain made them extraordinary soldiers. During World War II, small groups of Apache soldiers, from the White Mountain, San Carlos, and Mescalero Apache tribes, were recruited into elite communication units. Their mission was simple yet critical: transmit and receive coded messages in Apache so that the enemy could not intercept or interpret them. The Japanese and Germans, who could crack almost any code of the time, were powerless against the complexity of Apache speech. No written alphabet. No phonetic guide. No pattern to follow. A single Apache word could carry layers of meaning depending on tone, rhythm, and context, nuances impossible to translate. To the enemy it was gibberish. To American commanders it was gold. Imagine the scene. In the jungles of the Pacific or the mountains of Europe, a radio operator presses a transmitter. On the other end, another soldier listens closely as words of power flow through the static, syllables older than any modern nation. Within seconds, vital information about troop movements, coordinates, and attacks is delivered, safely, flawlessly. The Apache code talkers did their duty in silence. They were never allowed to speak of their work. For decades after the war ended, their contribution remained classified, hidden behind military secrecy. Only later, in the 1980s and 1990s, did the truth finally come to light. It was then that the world learned what the Apache had done. They had used the very language that America once tried to erase, to defend the very country that had taken their homeland. There is something both tragic and profoundly noble in that. But their story doesn't end with World War II. The Apache warrior spirit carried on through generations of soldiers who served in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Apache men and women joined the U.S. Armed Forces in numbers far greater than the national average, not out of blind loyalty but out of a deep sense of duty. For them, the warrior's path is not a choice, it is an inheritance. In Apache culture, to be a warrior is not about conquest. It is about protection, of the land, the people, and the sacred balance of life. That ancient principle found new meaning on modern battlefields. When Apache soldiers crouched behind walls in Fallujah or scanned the ridges of Afghanistan, they carried within them the same instincts their ancestors once used in the Dragoon Mountains. The same blood, the same fire, the same spirit of endurance. Many of these modern warriors still speak their ancestral language, pray before battle in the old way, and wear symbols of their heritage beneath their uniforms. Small talismans carved with mountain spirits or lightning symbols, reminders that the Apache strength flows from something greater than man alone. And when their missions end, when they return to the reservations or cities they now call home, they continue to serve, as teachers, community leaders, and guardians of their culture. Because for the Apache, the battle for identity is never over. It is fought every day, in schools, in homes, in the hearts of their children. In 2008, the United States formally honored the Native American code talkers, including the Apache, for their service. Medals were awarded, speeches were given, and the world finally recognized what should have been known all along, that without these brave men, the course of history might have been very different. But for the Apache themselves, no ceremony could truly capture what it meant. Because their greatest victory was not on the battlefield. It was in the survival of their voice. The same language that once echoed across desert canyons, carried in war cries and prayer songs, had crossed oceans and defeated empires. It had lived through silence and oppression, only to rise again in a moment of courage that changed the world. That is the Apache legacy, not merely of warriors but of survivors. Their strength lies not only in their arrows, rifles, or radios, but in their words, words powerful enough to hide armies, to save nations, and to defy extinction. Today, when we remember the Apache code talkers, We remember more than soldiers. We remember centuries of struggle, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between language and identity. We remember that freedom can be defended not just by force, but by heritage, by the voices of ancestors echoing through time. The old war songs have changed. The weapons are different. The world has moved on. But the Apache warrior endures, in every soldier who takes an oath, in every child who learns the language, in every whisper of the desert wind that says, "We are still here. We have always been here. And our words will never die." Ladies and gentlemen, as we stand at the end of this long trail through blood, fire, and time, we must pause, not to mourn but to understand. The story of the Apache is not just the story of warriors and wars. It is the story of human endurance, of spirit against steel, of the eternal struggle between freedom and control. The Apache did not vanish when the battles ended. Their lands were taken, their leaders imprisoned, their culture nearly erased. Yet they refused to disappear. Instead they adapted. They changed without surrendering. They bent without breaking. And that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson their history offers us today. In a world that moves faster than ever, where technology replaces tradition and noise drowns out wisdom, the Apache remind us that true strength does not come from what you hold, it comes from what you honor. They remind us that the measure of a people is not in their weapons or wealth, but in their ability to keep their fire alive when the world grows dark. Let us step for a moment into the desert, the heartland of the Apache soul. The land itself teaches their philosophy. The desert gives nothing easily. Water must be earned. Shelter must be built. Life must be fought for. But if you learn to respect the rhythm of the earth, the sunrise, the wind, the slow turning of the seasons, you find harmony in hardship. The Apache believed the land was not something to own, but something to belong to. They walked softly because every stone, every tree, every shadow was sacred. They hunted with gratitude, not greed. They took only what was needed, for they understood that to wound the land is to wound yourself. And that idea, ancient yet timeless, may be the wisdom we've forgotten. In our pursuit of progress, we've lost the patience of the desert. We've built machines to move mountains but forgotten how to listen to the wind. The Apache never made that mistake. They listened, and the land answered. The spirit of the Apache also teaches us about resilience, the art of survival through change. When faced with overwhelming odds, they didn't surrender to despair. They adapted. They learned the ways of their enemies, mastered their tools, and fought on their own terms. They could vanish into the rocks, strike without warning, and reappear miles away, not just because they were skilled fighters but because they were thinkers, observers, philosophers of war and life. That same adaptability lives today in every person who refuses to give up, in every community that rebuilds after loss, in every voice that speaks truth even when silenced. The Apache remind us that identity is not something that can be erased by conquest or rewritten by history books. It is carried in memory, in ritual, in the quiet strength of those who remember who they are, even when the world forgets. The warrior code of the Apache was never only about combat. It was about balance, between courage and wisdom, action and silence, the self and the tribe. A warrior was taught that bravery without understanding was recklessness, and that wisdom without courage was weakness. Every Apache child learned that to fight you must first know what you are fighting for. And perhaps that's a question we all must ask ourselves. What do we fight for today? Is it for power or for peace? For pride or for purpose? Because the Apache fought for something that cannot be bought or sold, freedom. Not the kind written in laws or treaties, but the kind that lives in the heart. The freedom to be yourself, to walk your land, to speak your language, to raise your children in your own way. That was what they bled for. That was what they died for. And that is what they still stand for. Another lesson the Apache leave us is about community and leadership. Their chiefs were not kings. They were chosen not by inheritance but by respect. Leadership had to be earned, through courage, wisdom, and generosity. An Apache leader listened before he commanded. He guided by example, not by authority. In a world today obsessed with titles and power, this humble form of leadership feels revolutionary. Imagine leaders who act not for personal gain but for the survival and dignity of their people. That was the Apache way. Even in their greatest defeats, the Apache showed dignity. When Geronimo finally surrendered in 1886, he did so not in shame but in pride, standing tall, looking his enemies in the eye. He said, "Once I moved like the wind. Now I am old, but my spirit will never die." And he was right. The wind still moves through the canyons of Arizona, whispering his name. It carries the stories of those who would not be broken. Men, women, and children who chose endurance over extinction. The modern world often celebrates speed, comfort, and control. The Apache teach us the opposite: patience, hardship, and harmony. They show us that peace is not the absence of struggle but the balance within it. That survival is not just about staying alive but about staying true. When we look at the challenges of our own time, environmental destruction, loss of culture, disconnection from nature, we can find wisdom in the Apache way. To protect the earth as family, not property. To listen before we act. To walk with awareness, humility, and courage. And above all, to remember that we are not separate from the world. We are part of it. The Apache understood this truth centuries before science could prove it. They knew that the same breath that fills our lungs moves through the mountains, the rivers, the trees. That every life, every creature, every element is bound together in an unbreakable web of existence. This understanding, this spiritual ecology, is perhaps their greatest gift to humanity. The Apache Wars may have ended more than a century ago, but the battle for understanding, respect, and balance continues. The real war was never just between soldiers and tribes. It was between arrogance and wisdom, domination and harmony, forgetting and remembering. And in that war, the war of the human spirit, the Apache still stand victorious,